This tired, out-of-touch Conservative government is devoid of vision and ideas. They're not just anti-democratic, they're totally out of touch with young Canadians and their struggling middle-class families, Mr. Speaker, and Canadians deserve better.
Over the next 20 minutes, I will provide an overview of the bill's overarching objectives and highlight some of its key initiatives. Our government continues to focus on what matters to Canadians, and this bill does nothing to detract from that. Bill C-31 focuses on creating jobs and economic growth while supporting families and communities. This is our government's 10th budget since 2006. Over that period, our country has been confronted by unprecedented economic challenges from beyond our borders. Canada has not only weathered the global economic storm, but has exceeded expectations. Let me remind members today that with the help of Canada's Economic Action Plan, Canada's economy has seen the best economic performance among all G7 countries and is the only G7 country to have an unwavering AAA rating with a stable outlook from all the major credit rating agencies, Moody's, Fitch, and Standard & Poor's. Nevertheless, in good times and bad, we have never strayed from our commitment to strengthen the economy for all Canadians and never wavered from seeing our plan through. Economic Action Plan 2014 marks the next chapter in keeping that commitment to Canadians, focusing on three key priorities: returning to budget balance, promoting jobs and economic growth, and supporting families and communities. Mr. Speaker, before I get into the details of the bill, let me begin by explaining the principles driving these priorities, starting with balancing the budget, the cornerstone of our low-tax plan. Returning to balanced budgets and basic economic principles of debt reduction means more tax dollars can be spent improving Canada's economic potential and growth prospects rather than servicing debt. These long-term benefits explain why our government has not wavered from our goal and has cut the deficit by nearly 2/3 since the Great Recession. It is also why Canada remains in an enviable fiscal position among all G7 countries with the lowest net debt to GDP ratio by far. Our goal is now within sight, Mr. Speaker. Including the measures announced in Economic Action Plan 2014, we expect to realize a surplus of $6.4 billion in 2015-16, including $3 billion of an annual adjustment for risk. Mr. Speaker, let me point out that we're doing all this without cutting major transfers to persons or other levels of government. At the same time as we're reining in spending, let me emphasize that transfers for Canadian priorities like education and health care will continue to increase. Bien que l'équilibre budgétaire.
While budget to balance is the cornerstone of our plan for prosperity, the government also believes that it's essential to create a framework to help businesses grow. The government will focus on improving tax competitiveness for businesses, and that is part of our policy focused on growth, which has enabled Canada to have the lowest corporate tax rate in the G7. But that's not all, Mr. Speaker. Canada is an increasingly dynamic place for investments and growth of businesses. In the most recent Bloomberg ranking for countries where it's most attractive to do business, Canada moved into second place behind Hong Kong.
That our greatest asset is also what will keep us a leader in the global economy, our people. This is why we continue to invest in training to help workers get the skills they need to succeed and connect more Canadians with available jobs. To better align training with labour market needs, the Canada Job Grant will launch this year, ensuring employers have input into skills training decisions. We're also working with provinces and territories to renew the $500 million a year labour market agreements. And our government will renegotiate the $1.95 billion per year labour market development agreements to better reorient training toward labour market demand. This, along with our commitment of $222 million annually, matched by the provinces and territories, over the next 4 years through a new generation of labour market agreements for persons with disabilities will strengthen Canada's job market and get Canadians working. Now, Mr. Speaker, I would like to turn to the specific measures in today's legislation. D'abord, la loi numéro 1 sur le plan d'action économique.
First of all, Economic Action Plan 2014, Act Number 1, centers on our commitment to families by announcing increased support for Canadian families who are taking responsibility for adopting a child. All parents must bear the costs of raising their children, but adoptive parents face additional costs, namely fees from the adoption agents and legal fees. These costs can be quite high, especially when children are adopted from abroad, and can include travel and accommodation costs, as well as costs linked to the translation of documents. With a view to better recognizing fiscally expenditures related to adoption, namely agency and legal fees, Economic Action Plan 2014 proposes increasing the maximum amount of the adoption expense tax credit, which was already increased in Economic Action Plan 2013, to $15,000 in 2014. This amount will be indexed to inflation for subsequent years. In addition, our government is committing to ensure that the tax regime takes into account the changing nature of Canadians' needs and the health system.
The excise tax ETA to improve the application of the GST-HST to the healthcare sector. Specifically, today's legislation proposes 3 changes to expand the tax relief under the GST-HST for certain health-related services and medical and assistive devices to reflect the evolving nature of the healthcare system. The first change is to expand the current GST-HST exemption for training that is specifically designed to help individuals cope with a disorder or disability to also exempt the services of designing training, such as developing a training plan. The second change is to exempt acupuncturists and naturopathic doctors' professional services from GST-HST. The third change is to add eyewear specifically designed to electronically enhance the vision of individuals with vision impairment that is supplied on the order of a physician or other specified health professional to the list of GST-HST free medical and assistive devices. Today's legislation also recognizes the important role played by research and rescue volunteers in their communities, protecting people while often risking their own safety. Bill C-31 proposes a 15% non-refundable search and rescue volunteers tax credit on an amount of $3,000 for ground, air, and marine search and rescue volunteers who perform at least 200 hours of eligible service in the year, starting in 2014. Our government is very proud to publicly recognize the outstanding commitments of these volunteers and the difference they make in their communities. Communities like my riding of North Vancouver. Mr. Speaker, North Shore Rescue is a daily example of the sacrifice that these brave men and women commit to every day. It's why I know measures like this will go a long way in supporting these selfless volunteers across Canada. Monsieur le Président, comme vous pouvez le voir,
Mr. Speaker, as you can see, we are protecting the health and well-being of Canadians. Promoting a clean and safe environment is also a priority for our government. For example, since 2006, our government has taken major steps to protect our natural environments, namely by adding more than 160,000 square kilometers to the Canadian network of national parks and maritime conservation areas, an increase of over 58%, and protecting close to 4,000 square kilometers of environmentally sensitive private land. Economic Action Plan 2014 contains measures to protect Canada's rich natural heritage through investments in national parks, conservation of the recreational fishery, expanding recreational paths, support for conservation based on families, and tax support for clean energy production. The legislative measures presented today are designed specifically to encourage additional donations for environmentally sensitive land areas to charitable organizations looking after conservation by doubling to 10 years the period for tax purposes. This is based on a recommendation that comes from the Standing Committee report on finances in its report of 2013 with respect to charitable donations in Canada.
Through Canada's Economic Action Plan 2014, we are keeping taxes low, putting consumers first, protecting Canadians' health and safety, and strengthening communities from coast to coast to coast. Bill C-31 expands on the government's consumer-focused measures to improve the bottom line for Canadian families and ensure that they are getting value for their hard-earned dollars. Since 2006, our government has taken significant action to support and protect Canadian consumers. We have reduced taxes and tariffs, ensured marketplace fairness, promoted competition in industries such as financial services, telecommunications and air services, and improved product and food safety. Through the Consumers First agenda, measures contained in Economic Action Plan 2014, our government is going even further. One key focus for our government has been encouraging competition and lower prices in the telecommunications market. Today's legislation proposes new measures to do this by capping wholesale domestic wireless roaming rates to prevent wireless providers from charging other companies, who may be their competitors, more than they charge their own customers for mobile voice data and text services. Our government will also bring forward future legislation to provide telecommunications regulators with the power to impose administrative monetary penalties on companies that violate rules such as the Wireless Code, further enhancing competition in the telecommunications market. Mr. Speaker, the list goes on. I could speak well beyond my allotted time on the benefits of today's legislation. Let me very quickly list some of the other positive measures in Bill C-31. Creating the Canada Apprentice Loan. This new initiative will help apprentices registered in Red Seal trades by providing access to over $100 million in interest-free loans each year. Eliminating tariffs on mobile offshore drilling units used in offshore oil and gas exploration to improve the global competitiveness of Canadian energy projects. Investing $11 million over 2 years and $3.5 million per year ongoing to strengthen the labour market opinion process, ensuring Canadians are given the first chance at available jobs. Strengthening Canada's anti-money laundering and anti-terrorist financing regime, as well as additional measures to fight tax evasion, ensuring all Canadians pay their fair share. Cutting red tape on more than 50,000 employers by reducing the maximum number of required payments on account of source deductions. Reducing costs and red tape for all Canadian businesses by harmonizing Canada's trademark framework with international norms. And providing $165 million over 2 years on a cash basis to advance the construction of a new bridge for the St. Lawrence. Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, in my presentation today, I have provided an overview of the many ways that the Economic Action Plan 2014 will benefit Canadians. Let's look at the facts. Canada has recovered more than the total of jobs lost during the recession. More than 1 million more Canadians are working today than at the end of the recession in 2009. Nearly 90% of these jobs are full-time jobs, and that is by far the greatest employment growth in the G7.
On track to balance the budget in 2015 and 2016 as promised. But this has not deterred us from making Canada one of the best places to do business or from providing tax relief for all Canadians. We've cut taxes in every way government collects them, and have removed over 1 million low-income Canadians from the tax rolls. I will remind my colleagues that a Canadian family of 4 saves nearly $3,400 in 2014. So while the NDP and the Liberals keep demanding reckless spending, our government will stay the course with fiscal prudence. When the Liberal leader suggests questionable economic policy and claims that budgets balance themselves, our government will stay the course to balance the budget. And when the opposition calls for higher taxes and taking more money from hard-working Canadians, our government will stay the course with our low-tax plan. Mr. Speaker, quite simply, it is our government that has had to make the tough decisions and stick to our priorities, the priorities of all Canadians. For that reason, we have remained steadfast in our commitment to strengthen the economy for all Canadians. To sum up, in an uncertain world, Canada's Economic Action Plan is working, creating jobs, keeping the economy growing, and returning to balanced budgets. By staying the course and sticking to our proven track record and Economic Action Plan, Canada remains on track for a great future. I therefore strongly encourage all members of the House to read the legislation and give it the support that it deserves. Merci beaucoup.
Amazing. Amazing that after a full 25 minutes of debate on a 350-page bill that the government has stuffed full of all sorts of gems isn't the right word. There's another word for it that I don't think I'm allowed to use here in Parliament. This government has decided that they need to shut down that debate because it's obviously gone on too long. That they brought in 25 minutes and a few more after that, that should be enough to study a bill that affects 40 Canadian laws, has over 500 clauses in it, almost none of them designed to help the Canadian economy. Now, Mr. Speaker, as this is my first speech as finance critic for the official opposition, I first want to make mention and thanks to the member from Parkdale High Park, who did such an incredible job on this portfolio for a number of years. She developed a strong relationship, absolutely dignified, and brought New Democrats to a strong place when talking about financial measures, and a relationship with not only the banking community, the small business and entrepreneurial community in this country. I owe a great debt to the amount of work that the member from Parkdale High Park did. Now, from the perspective of which I come, representing a rural, remote part of the country in northwestern British Columbia, being a former small business owner myself, I have great familiarity with the struggles, the challenges, and the opportunities for those of us who operate in small and medium-sized businesses in this country, for those businesses which exist in resource-based economies, in the rural parts of this country, of which 70–80% of the Toronto Stock Exchange exists on those resource and extractive economies. Now, what these businesses are looking for primarily is a government that understands them, that listens to Bay Street a little less and more often is consulting and meeting with those people on Main Street, that understands what a small business and medium-sized business has to go through to put food on the table, and that primarily they need a strong economy and one that provides them with customers, one that provides them with a viable way to grow and expand their businesses. Now, what we've seen from a government too often from the Conservative side and previously has led us to the position our economy is in right now, that there are 400,000 missing manufacturing jobs since before the recession, since the Conservatives took over. The Conservatives call that excellent. There are 300,000 jobs that have still not been replaced since the beginning of the recession. The youth unemployment rate is twice the national average, and Canadians now owe more money at a personal debt ratio than any other country in the OECD. We are one of the most indebted nations in the world, and this government says all is fine and all is rosy. Now, their policies are based on a simple principle of rip and ship. Take the resources and the wealth that is the endowment of this country and send them out in their most raw form. Don't add value. Don't seek to enhance any of the qualities of those resources, and the results are stark. Our trade deficit is at a staggering level. We are operating in a trade deficit position and have been so for a number of years. $45 billion, and it doesn't seem to preoccupy the Conservatives at all. We've seen finance minister after finance minister, well, now two, come forward and misunderstand the the tellings and the signs in the economy. The previous finance minister missed the global recession entirely, thought it was a blip, thought it was a bump in the road and nothing to be concerned with. And in the midst of the first months of that recession, this government brought in an austerity budget, countering every other G20 country in the world saying, well, Conservatives know best on the economy. The fact is they don't, Mr. Speaker, and the fact is that the evidence, the mounting evidence on the economic mismanagement of the Conservatives are piling up. Now we have the Budget Implementation Act, a bill crammed with all sorts of things that I, again, can't mention with their proper terms. Things like the temporary foreign worker program. Suddenly the Conservatives are going to get tough on the very program that they've allowed companies to abuse. 2 years ago they said they were going to go after those bad companies. They were going to put them on a blacklist, Mr. Speaker. Well, you know how many companies are sitting on that blacklist today after 2 years? 0. Not a 1. Well, then that would lead to believe that maybe no companies are abusing the temporary foreign worker program. Oh, wait, just one province alone, the province of Alberta, has found 100 cases just in Alberta of companies abusing the massive loopholes in the temporary foreign worker program that this government created. HD mining, certain banks have started to export jobs that we didn't think you could export. Mining jobs, financial sector jobs, jobs that have been the heart of this economy for many years. I know, Mr. Speaker, with the clock being what it is, I'll be finishing my comments tomorrow, but allow me to establish this, that both on form and on substance, that this government has failed Canadians once again. They have a missed opportunity in this monster omnibus bill, fundamentally anti-democratic, not according to just me, but according to the Prime Minister when he used to occupy this place. New Democrats will oppose this bill every step of the way. Thank you.
This is the Conservatives' first bill to implement Budget 2014. It is, again, another massive omnibus budget bill, 359 pages in length, almost 500 separate clauses. Ce projet de loi regroupe
This bill covers a host of measures that should not be in a budget bill, and with their attempts to limit debate on these important issues, these are measures that have no link together, and they're being lumped together in a bill. The Conservatives chose to take this approach to push through the adoption of the bill and to prevent examination of these measures by Parliament.
The inconsistency, and some would say hypocrisy, that the government is demonstrating is exemplified by the Prime Minister, who, in his own words, as an opposition MP, and I heard my colleague from Skeena-Bulkley Valley refer to this quotation a few minutes ago. In 1994, the Prime Minister, as an opposition MP, said in this House, quote, "In the interest of democracy, I ask, how can members represent their constituents on these various areas when they are forced to vote in a bloc on such legislation and on such concerns? We can agree with some of the measures but oppose others. How do we express our views and the views of our constituents when the matters are so diverse?" And he went further. He said, "The bill contains many distinct proposals and principles, and asking members to provide simple answers to such complex questions is in contradiction to the conventions and practices of the House, and I ask government members to give serious consideration to this issue of democracy." Mr. Speaker, the Liberal omnibus legislation that the then opposition member, now Prime Minister, was talking about at that time in 1994 was 21 pages in length and altered 11 pages of legislation, or pieces of legislation. That's a far cry from the 359-page document that lies before us today. And I can't for the life of me understand how the Prime Minister and others who were part of that reform movement at that time could live with themselves today, when in fact what they're doing goes far deeper against the principles that they articulated at that time. The Conservatives are continuing their reckless abuse of power by using these huge omnibus bills and underhanded procedural maneuvers to force these policies through. They are ignoring public outcry from coast to coast to coast, but they're also potentially creating bad public policy, because the committees that ought to be considering and ultimately voting on these pieces of legislation, wherein greater expertise lie, are being cut out of the discussion. Perhaps some level of engagement of committees when it comes to the evaluation of the legislation, but not at the critical points at which we vote at committee to pass pieces of this legislation. So we are being asked to consider measures, for instance, compassionate leave, sickness benefits, search and rescue, volunteer tax credits, expanding the adoption expense tax credit, medical expense tax credits. Many of these we would actually be quite supportive of as individual measures. And it's unfortunate that these positive measures are being lumped together with some very unreasonable and harmful and regressive measures that we can't support. The bill also includes new rules around FATCA, the U.S. Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act. And under this bill, we as Canadians, our Canadians are going to be doing effectively the dirty work and becoming tax collectors for the IRS. Canada-U.S. dual citizens are going to be punished if they don't provide their U.S. tax number to the CRA. If these Canadians do provide their U.S. tax number, the Canadian government will then hand over all this information together with information on the Canadians' bank accounts to the U.S. This will help the U.S. collect tax on registered Canadian savings accounts, including RDSPs, registered disability savings plans, and RESPs, registered education savings plans, and tax-free savings accounts. The other night when we were at the briefing by the Finance Canada public servants, they couldn't answer a very simple question, and that is whether or not the contributions made to our DSPs and RESPs by the Canadian government, those matching grants that are made by the Canadian government to those accounts, would be taxable by the Americans or considered taxable. They could not answer that basic question. It was never the public policy intention of RDSPs and RESPs to subsidize the American Treasury. They were to help Canadians, families with individuals with disabilities, and to help young Canadians get good educations. And yet the Conservatives could not, or the Conservatives are incapable of actually answering that question. They have not stood up for Canadian interests during these negotiations. This budget bill also changes rules around rail safety, food safety, hazardous products. It centralizes control over regional development in my part of the country, over ACOA, and takes away authority with regional boards on ACOA and dissolves those boards and moves all the decision-making to Ottawa. Dissolves ECBC without real consultation with communities, again centralizing decision-making to Ottawa about matters that Atlantic Canadians, frankly, may have greater expertise and understanding of. This bill also changes the number of federal judges, and you'd think the government would have learned something from the Nadal fiasco, and ultimately one of the casualties of previous budget implementation bills was that the government's credibility when it came to appointments of Supreme Court justices. Because we'll recall that it was in a previous Budget Implementation Act that the government changed the rules, or rather the legislation, the Supreme Court Act, around the appointment of judges to try to facilitate the appointment of Justice Nadal, and we know how that ended up. It didn't end up well. I mean, the Supreme Court came back and refused to go along with the government on this. That is the kind of bad public policy outcome we have when we force all these unrelated measures through the House in an omnibus budget bill of this scale. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to talk a little bit about what's not in budget, or rather in Bill C-31. There is nothing in this act, or there's very little in this piece of legislation, to address some of the most serious concerns facing Canadian families today. There is little in this bill that will actually help struggling middle-class families who are having difficulty making ends meet. Conservatives have failed to recognize that large groups within the Canadian economy and society are being left out of this so-called economic recovery. In my part of Nova Scotia, the Annapolis Valley, the Stats Canada region that tracks unemployment and employment and labor figures gives some very telling data. Now, I represent, it's for Hants County, Kings County, and Annapolis County. Hants and Kings and Annapolis are represented by myself and the member for West Nova. And since the recession, residents in this part of Nova Scotia have seen good-paying, full-time jobs replaced by temporary and part-time work. And that data is laid out for us by Stats Canada. We have seen part-time jobs increase by 1,700. In the same period, the region has lost 9,800 full-time jobs. The percentage of residents in the area who are working age and have a job, labor market participation, has plummeted from 61.6% to 54%. This is what is happening in my part of Nova Scotia. We're seeing it in families, we're seeing it in small businesses, we're seeing real economic challenges, and the government seems so out of touch when they talk about this recovery as if it is a monolithic recovery that is affecting and helping people in all regions of the country, because there are groups and who are simply being left behind. And a lot of families are struggling just to get by. These Canadians are tired of the uncertainty. They are tired of struggling to find work, to try to make ends meet when they've lost full-time jobs and replaced with part-time work. They're facing record levels of personal debt. The average household in Canada now owes a record $1.66 for every dollar of disposable income. But instead of using this budget to help address some of these challenging needs of middle-class families, the Conservatives continue to ignore them. In the previous 4 Conservative budgets, the Conservatives have actually raised taxes on hard-working Canadian families. Budget 2013 actually raised taxes on imported goods, everything from household goods to wigs for cancer patients. And sadly, the Conservatives have raised taxes because they needed the money to cover for their waste and mismanagement. They spent millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars they've spent on advertising, but they spent millions to advertise a jobs program that didn't even exist. Meanwhile, the middle class are struggling under record levels of personal debt, and the Conservatives are raising taxes on them just to support their own profligacy and wasteful spending on advertising. Canadian youth are struggling, and this bill ignores the unemployment and underemployment changes of young Canadians, or challenges of young Canadians. Due to Conservative inaction on youth unemployment and underemployment, we risk losing a generation of potential. And we will feel the economic consequences of this disinterest in young Canadians for decades. For young Canadians, there are 265,000 fewer jobs than before the downturn. TD Economics has estimated that prolonged high levels of unemployment and underemployment among young Canadians will cost the Canadian economy $23 billion. And for those who like to argue that youth unemployment is always bad following a recession, it's time to look beyond the simple unemployment rate and examine the whole story. For example, the gap between Canada's youth unemployment and adult unemployment has now reached an all-time high. Our young people are simply left out of this so-called recovery.
Also, the unemployment rate doesn't reflect the fact that there are some very discouraged young people who've given up looking for jobs.
Students are finding a harder and harder time finding summer work. Many of them are taking unpaid internships just for work experience. Lack of paid work means students are graduating from university with high levels of debt. The need today, post-recession, is actually greater for government intervention in summer jobs than it was before the downturn. Yet, the Canada Summer Jobs Program last summer created half the number of summer jobs it did back in 2005. So the need is greater today, and the government is doing half as much to create jobs for students during the summer. And this isn't just affecting young Canadians, it's affecting parents and in many cases grandparents who are footing the bills. According to TD Bank, more than half of baby boom parents are providing financial support to adult children who are no longer in school. Nearly half. And 43% have allowed their adult children to live at home rent-free for extended periods of time. Helping adult children make ends meet is actually leading a lot of middle-class families into greater levels of debt and dipping into retirement savings. It's also one of the reasons why Canadian parents 55 years of age or older are more likely to refinance their mortgages if they have children than if they were not. Their average household debt is actually twice that of their childless peers. They're more likely to take on higher non-mortgage debt, such as higher credit card debt and lines of credit, which is one of the reasons non-mortgage debt in Canada continues to climb. The average Canadian owes $28,000 in non-mortgage debt today. That's at a record high. There are too many young Canadians looking for work, and there are too many middle-class Canadian families struggling under crushing levels of personal debt. This bill does little to help Canadian youth or their middle-class families, and offers no real vision for the future. I'd like to speak about something that is in this Budget Implementation Act, and that is the measures regarding FATCA. The Conservatives have actually turned Canadians into American tax collectors, or want to turn Canadians into American tax collectors through this Budget Implementation Act. Earlier this year, when the Conservatives signed an intergovernmental agreement with the U.S. to implement FATCA, we had hoped that some of these concerns we had would have been addressed. Canada and the U.S. had previously achieved an agreement to exchange information on suspected tax cheats, but FATCA goes a step further than any other tax-sharing legislation has. It requires Canadian banks to give the CRA the account information of every U.S. citizen living in Canada. The CRA would then give this information to the IRS and those U.S. persons who have to file taxes in the U.S. The problem is that there are many U.S. citizens living in Canada, and they don't even know that they're considered American for tax purposes. This includes any person born in the U.S. or born to an American parent, even if they haven't lived in the U.S. since they were a toddler. The Canadian government has agreed to help the IRS find these individuals. This also affects Canadians who aren't even U.S. citizens, they're just married to one, because their joint accounts will now be reported to the IRS. This is a remarkable breach of Canadians' privacy by their own government. Not only will the CRA provide the IRS information with tax identification information and account balances of U.S. persons without their knowledge, they will impose a $100 penalty for each instance of non-compliance. So why are the Conservatives prepared to do Uncle Sam's work in this case and potentially penalize Canadians with dual citizenship or their Canadian spouses? U.S. persons living in Canada will be required to report and pay taxes to the U.S. on their RDSPs and RESPs. These accounts are supposed to help Canadians pay for their education or to help disabled Canadians avoid poverty. The money was not intended that Canadian tax dollars, Canadian government money, would be used to subsidize the U.S. Treasury. So why are the Conservatives allowing this to happen when it so clearly is inconsistent with the objectives of RDSPs and RESPs? The other night, as I mentioned earlier today, we asked the public servants at the briefing whether or not Canadian government contributions, the matching grants to RESPs and RDSPs, would be considered taxable by the Americans, by the IRS. They couldn't answer the question, Mr. Speaker. The idea that we would sign an agreement when we don't know something as basic as that speaks to the degree to which this government has lost influence and power and authority in negotiating with the Americans. The reality is that the FATCA agreement is very important. And it should be a standalone piece of legislation. We should be doing a more thorough evaluation of the agreement that the government has signed, and it should not be part of a Budget Implementation Act, an omnibus bill. We have constitutional law experts like Peter Hogg who have raised concerns about whether or not the agreement violates the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So there are real issues around this that will be given short shrift through the process by which a Budget and Implementation Act, that is such a massive omnibus bill, will be given by Parliament. There are also provisions in this Budget Implementation Act for demutualization. Now, I've heard from insurance providers in Nova Scotia who worry that these changes potentially will hurt rural Canadians. Even the government's own report on demutualization tells us, quote, concerns were expressed that demutualization would lead to consolidation, reduced competition, access to services, and weaken ties to rural communities in which most mutual companies are based. So again, measures on demutualization are something that we need to consider more thoroughly. What is clear, Mr. Speaker, is that this tired, out-of-touch Conservative government is devoid of vision and ideas. They're not just anti-democratic, they're totally out of touch with young Canadians and their struggling middle-class families, Mr. Speaker, and Canadians deserve better.